Just a quick intro here. Obviously, we've got Kun from the Accelerator, Blockchain Builders, and obviously leading the BAS here. We've got Guy Wuollet from Andreessen, and we've got Evan Miyazono, Head of Research from Protocol Labs. All right, guys, take it away.
All right, thank you, Gil. So what the talk before lunch break, so be mindful of that.
So try and keep it really entertaining.
Yeah, definitely. So just to start off, so my name is Kun for people who arrived today. Was not part of the kickoff speech yesterday. So my name is Kun Peng. I'm the founder of Stanford Blockchain Accelerator program and also a founder of the BAS conference. So today we have awesome panelists. We have Evan Miyazono and Guy Wuollet from ACCZ and Protocol Labs. So I will let each of them does intro and background of yourself.
Briefly, undergrad here in material science and engineering, PhD in applied physics, and joined Protocol Labs as the first PhD hire, helped with in 2017, went through and joined all the madness and ended up leading basically the entire, building and leading the entire interface between academia and the company. That led to a lot of like fun meta research, special projects, things like that. So I've been on the weird exploration side for a company that does a lot of generally weird exploration of the adjacent possible in the future.
I went to school here, and it's very fun to be back in this room and actually sitting down in front. Evan and I were talking about that a minute ago. Then I was part of the first crypto startup school cohort. Our team ran a couple years back and tried to build a decentralized internet service provider, which of course failed. But then I joined Evan and worked on the research team at Protocol Labs, and then joined our investing team a couple of years ago.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the intro. So you remember, Guy, like when I joined Stanford Blockchain Club, you're actually joining ACCZ. So yeah, looking forward to a fun and entertaining discussion. Very interesting topic and hot topic, AI and crypto. So start off, we'll divide the questions probably in two categories. We'll start off with more like how crypto could benefit AI, and later on we'll just switch gear to how AI could benefit crypto. That being said, let's dive into more of the first section. So seems like AI model, LLM, and all those fancy words are very popular nowadays, especially around this area, Stanford, Silicon Valley. So that being said, AI model seems to be pretty centralized and top-down. So one intuitive way of how to improve the trustworthiness and the transparency of AI model is actually using crypto, some of the blockchain technologies. So I would like to get some thoughts from our panelists on when and how should models be verifiable, and what should go on chain and why?
Sure, I'll take a stab at this. So I think there has been a lot of really interesting development towards ZK proving and a lot of discussion around ZK-ML. And one of the big questions that I've been trying to answer for myself personally, especially at a conference talking about blockchain applications and not just blockchain infrastructure, is when should you actually be running a verifier for a ZK proof or an optimistic verifier for some machine learning model or some LLM off-chain on-chain. And at least from my point of view, there's sort of a spectrum. There are obviously the use cases where some centralized entity is running a model, and you want them to prove that they're running the correct model because they've made some economic guarantee to you, and perhaps the simple version of this is I'm using ChatGPT, and I want the model not to get better or worse, but to be the same model, a month from now that I'm running today because I'm paying for it, and so they can produce a proof and deliver that to me, and they don't necessarily have to reveal information about the model. I think that's probably the least blockchain version of this intersection. Then the next would be I'm actually running an open source model locally because I really care about having it be censorship resistant, and perhaps it's limited in the scope or the capability because it is an open source model running on consumer hardware. And then I think there's the most interesting question, which is the third. When should I be proving the output of a model on chain? and what applications are actually compelling for that. And I think there's some obvious ones like I want a more complicated pricing function for my DEX, and so I'm going to prove it on-chain, or I have a very long running computation off-chain, and it's going to be cheaper to prove it on-chain. But when and how you actually need a machine learning model for that, I think, is an open question. And there's been a ton of investment and interest, intellectual energy around being able to prove these computations, but I think a lot less discussion about what computation should we actually be proving. And so I'm very hopeful that some people in the audience here today will be answering that question over the coming years.
And then there's a bunch of interesting problems that people see with AI, like the concept of watermarking outputs, where like it's hard not to reach for blockchains as a potential direction you could solve that. Obviously, there's no like intuitive solution because it's a really hard problem, but that some amount of data provenance, governance, reward. I was joking earlier that because I work mostly in coordination systems at this point at Protocol Labs, if you will hear me say the word governance probably an uncomfortable number of times. I think that like a lot of the hardest problems we want to assume will be solved with better capabilities. Or better tooling, and I think that some of them are actually just wicked problems or like fundamental limits based on the systems that we're building and the problems that we want to throw them at. And figuring like it's going to be a lot of no non-cliched answers past that. Happy to move on.
All right, sure. Thank you. And this tends to be, I think, a pretty popular area. Actually, one of our incubator startup, Modulus, is actually doing like ZKML, which is quite interesting. They presented earlier today as well. So let's assume like the model like is actually trustworthy. It's supposed to work as like works as it's supposed to be. But what if like the models are like biased? Is there anything crypto can do to alleviate bias, or just curious about your thoughts there?
I think that there's it's reasonable to try to minimize like explicit bias, but it will never be sufficient to minimize bias. Every system will have bias. All data is intrinsically biased. It's funny, the saying, the plural of anecdote is not data, actually started as the plural of anecdote is data, because every data point has its own story. Back in the saying dates back to like Francis Bacon and the scientific revolution. The most important thing seems to be being able to track the biases in your data, have reputation systems for what that is, be able to attribute what those biases are to named individuals or institutions. I think that applications that do identity and reputation using things like the Stellar Consensus Protocol to say like, I trust this data set because I trust these institutions or these entities that trust the people who created this will end up being far more robust than institutions just pushing a model into the world and people saying like, well, they seem to have the most capabilities, therefore they are also the least biased in ways that are harmful is going to be very unlikely. And I think that you can also have really interesting applications of things like licensing or registration on chain, where you have governance systems that are delegating trust to issuers of licenses or registrations to models specifically being tracked in a very public and open way.
Yeah, I think the best solution to bias in any system is to have other systems that are competing against it. And so instead of having one LLM that everyone agrees provides canonical truth, let's have a bunch of different ones trained by different companies with different both implicit and explicit biases that every individual or project can choose to use. And so I think part of this is a question of access and of opportunity, and that's what I think crypto gets right, is allowing anyone to participate from anywhere in the world with any background. And I think like the most tangible example of this is a company we recently invested in, Jensen, is providing a marketplace to allow anyone to train an LLM on GPUs that anyone else can contribute. And so hopefully it will be simpler for anyone from either their parents' basement or their dorm room at Stanford to be proposing new models and be competing with the existing incumbents, so that to the extent you disagree with the biases in the existing models, you actually can solve that problem.
And I think it really, having good competition like that requires that we're not in a winner-takes-all oligopoly. We need regulation and governance structures, maybe self-regulation, that keeps these as open protocols, because I firmly believe that open protocols are the antitrust of network effects. And if you want to make sure that you have reasonable amounts of competition between different projects, tools, models, then you really need them to be able to be evaluated on reasonably equal footing and used interoperably or interchangeably.
The other answer is just open source, which is not a crypto answer, but I'm a huge fan of what Facebook has done recently. I think that's fantastic for the world.
Unless you're worried about AI risk, in which case.
I think Evan is a little bit more worried than I am.
I think that we should all probably be a little bit more worried about the progressive automation of an economy that would lead to human disempowerment, humans not in the loop because the systems that we have automated are running enough things without our input.
Can we have permission to take the next 20 minutes and argue about accelerationism?
Well, let's try to finish the question first. But I also actually counted, so Evan mentioned 3 times so far, governance, the word governance. We'll see if it break double digits at the end of this conversation. The next one is, I think you guys touched a bit, where a lot of people are trying to set up decentralized marketplaces or using kind of reputation system. I think where crypto can help, where you can potentially create a kind of incentive, a token incentive mechanism to incentivize models, and they can compete each other against each other. So the question actually is, how can you tell, how do you design that model, and also how can you tell what is a good behavior you need to incentivize and bad behavior to punish model, and how to measure a good model and make it more kind of explainable. I mean, these possible to design a system around it.
I think part of this question is what is a good model and what is a bad model, and even that seems to be a fairly open academic field where there's no good answer about precisely how to measure the performance of something like an LLM. And that is actually, I think, true more broadly for any protocol or system design, that the hardest part is often coming up with a quantifiable objective function around which you're designing your mechanism. And that's probably what I'm best suited to talk about, the actual implementation and design of the system, assuming you have some objective, we want to do really well on the SAT with our model. That, I think, is usually much simpler and is more akin to engineering as opposed to philosophy, hopefully makes it more straightforward. So I think that's oftentimes a question that each individual project or person should be asking themselves, as to what is the thing that we care about, as opposed to how can we all agree on what good or what bad is, which I think is actually impossible.
And I think that we can at least have better tooling and structures and architectures for AI than here's a monolithic system that we're using RLHF on to try and make it better. And I've grown increasingly interested by the interpretability approach from conjecture and also the open agency architecture as tools that will let you, as humans, look into these large AI systems in intermediate steps in their operation and say, this is what good behavior, these are properties of what I think good behavior should be, and then have it that as part of the architecture that forces the automation side to meet that or follow that those guidelines for good behavior, because this is roughly what we do for human agents. Laws, the way we describe human action is with laws that require huge amounts of judiciary infrastructure outside of the laws themselves to say nope, that is legal, that is not legal. It's amazing what you can do with information and formal verification in the world of information processing and data, but I think that it is possible to push some of those capabilities into creating languages to describe behavior in the real world, and then use statements in those languages to limit the behavior of AI systems, highly intelligent automated problem solvers.
Thank you. That being said, I want to switch to the other side, which is how AI could benefit crypto. And if you have time, we can also take questions from the audience. Very interesting part of AI is actually generative AI. So you can actually create a massive amount of images, which will look like real. So will we see a crypto renaissance from a generative AI use cases? If so, what do you think like that will look like?
For like, I think years now, I've wanted there to be a blockchain that calls itself the public record. And in the same way that we'll talk about things that are like posted to wherever on the internet being part of the public record now, and we assume that they are like publicly known to be true because they're part of the public record, I think that there will be a point where you can assume that if there's a thing you want to find, that it exists out there on the internet, whether it's true or false, and therefore the world will be the internet will be overwhelmed by false information. And the only way that you will track things as being true or as being interesting or compelling is that someone will have an attestation of like, I took this picture and I've posted it on the public record, or I wrote this thing and have signed it on the public record, or like some like compression of a hash onto some L2 onto the public record. But I think that there is something fantastic about the immutability and decentralization of blockchains when it comes to like the mass proliferation of generated AI content. And this is going to be very important for society at large to be able to have places that you can trust, and that trust is going to come from institutions that people already believe in and is delegated by those institutions to objects.
I think if we think about crypto as digital scarcity, and that's what a lot of the NFT projects have focused on, AI is creating digital abundance. Crypto is naturally very complementary by allowing and enforcing digital scarcity. And so like one of the open questions is whether people actually care if something is generated by an AI or generated by a person. And I think in the short term, we probably will care quite a bit. But in the long term, I would suspect we actually probably don't care that much.
I think there are categories of things that we'll always care about, like if a potential newsworthy item is, and like also as we dial back the amount of hallucination, or as we get better at distinguishing between what is a hallucination and what is not from generative AI.
Yes, I think all of the focus around entertainment, things like video or images or media, in the short term, I think people will care a lot about whether it's generated by a human or by an AI. In the longer term, I suspect societally will become much more used to having things generated by an AI.
It'll map to like, does this satisfy the use case as I bring to it, whether it's like, do I want to understand a thing better? Then you care about whether it's true or not whether it was generated by an AI or not.
Yeah, this bumps into some of the proof of personhood work, and I think it's a very interesting question eventually. If you have agents that are trained online that can update their own model by paying people to contribute data, paying people with at-home GPUs to update the model itself, and then they offer some set of goods and services, and they basically become, I think, like the first autonomous digital organism. Like, do we treat them the same way we treat people? Do we care about whether or not, you know, like all of a sudden an LLM is contributing to my DAO? Like, does it get a different number of tokens or rewards? Is it treated differently in the forums? Like, can it make governance proposals? It's the first time I've said governance. I think all of these are interesting questions that we'll have to tackle with over the coming years. And at least in my opinion, I suspect people will become much more, it'll become much more socially acceptable to treat the on-chain model the way you do the Anon Twitter account.
Guy 1, Evan 3. You should mention more governance. Go ahead. You want to talk more, or are you good?
I was going to mention that I think that the idea of like agentic AI out in the world is very interesting, somewhat worrisome. Won't get into the worrisome side unless we have time at the end. But I was going to recommend generally the Ted Chiang short story, Crumbs from the Table, where he described, it was a story written as an article in Nature about the end of human science, because all science has started being done by meta-humans, and it maps over to like agentic artificial intelligence surprisingly well.
Cool. So you've listened to the podcast, I think, recently released from Ali, I think, Dan Bonnet, had a very good discussion around like crypto AI topics. So one of the part that they mentioned is like some part like smart contract audit can be somewhat automated using LLM, and also people are running like models on wallets to detect scams. I think those are like pretty well discussed, at least covered in the podcast. So we're trying to have a more interesting discussion with a topic underexplored, at least not covered in the podcast. So that being said, I'd like to explore a little bit more on the usability side of things. So I think crypto is facing the mass adoption problem, and one of the like major challenge is usability challenge. That being said, do you guys think like could AI help alleviate or solve the crypto UX problem? If so, what it would look like?
I like your take on this.
Okay. This isn't as much related to AI, so you can tell me to give you a different answer. But Zaki had a good talk a couple months back at Research Day, essentially saying for a long time, people in crypto have assumed that some fantastic product designer is going to come out of Apple or another big tech company and build a much better front end, and all of a sudden, all of crypto's UX challenges will be solved. And the purpose of his talk is basically saying that's wrong. And I tend to agree with him. I think we need to build better infrastructure that enables simpler user experiences as opposed to building very complex infrastructure and just assuming someone will abstract it into a better user experience. And towards that end, I think things like account abstraction and the broad excitement around intents are actually very promising, where what a user supplies to a blockchain can be much, much simpler. And you can have much better, for lack of a better word, trust models. And so one thing that's particularly exciting is the idea that instead of a user having to give Ethereum an execution trace, they can say, I want to perform this high-level action, and some solver will propose to them a specific execution trace, and the solver oftentimes can be profitable in the form of MEV, whereas the user has a much simpler user experience. And I'm not sure that LLMs or transformers specifically map onto this perfectly today, but I am, I think, very excited generally about that category of evolution in infrastructure enabling better user experiences as opposed to punting everything to UX.
Yeah, you could almost imagine that being a two-part solution, or the intense side of things being a two-part solution where one group creates a very human-focused, easy UX marketplace where if someone maps an intent to a trace or a tool to do that, then you can have something that's very easy to use for users, and then you can populate it primarily with systems that are doing automation to generate traces like this.
Yeah, I think the other left curve take is just that crypto is very complicated today, and if you've ever encouraged a parent or a friend to Google how do I use Ethereum? The top 10 results are usually pretty poor, with the exception of ethereum.org. And so the simple answer to this is your LLM can now actually be trained on the correct information and can talk to normal users who aren't spending their nights and weekends at conferences like this and reading through documentation. And that, I think, is not crypto specific. That's a benefit that AI will bring to almost all technical domains, and is very exciting.
Yeah, especially software domains. I think that I would bet that how do I use Ethereum is one of those questions where ChatGPT will give you a better answer than any of the top 10 results on Google.
Which is
primarily
great.
Because it's interactive. But also definitely not crypto specific. It's holds for most programming tasks.
Awesome. We have about 6 minutes left. We're also just before launch. So if folks are starving, just don't raise your hand, and we'll just head to launch. But you are really curious of asking questions, and you can raise your hand.
The only questions worth delaying lunch are controversial, so please
yes.
Get in there.
And also make them mention more governance.
I think it's definitely worth thinking about. There are a lot of open questions. I don't know that anyone has some canonical answer to what you're asking. I think, so to give context, the state of the art, it's not possible today with validity or ZK proofs to, for example, prove something like GPT-3 or 4. You can prove or you can prove training of much smaller models, but you can't prove training of something like an LLM. And I do think there's the question of whether, as the LLMs get bigger over time, it will ever be possible to prove training purely in zero knowledge. And one answer is yes, because if you look at a chart of the performance of improving in zero knowledge. It's actually the pace of improvement in zero knowledge is faster than the pace of improvement in naive execution, which would, if you look at these curves, eventually tell you you can prove things in zero knowledge faster than you can run them natively, which is, of course, farcical.
You're willing to extrapolate wildly.
Yes, precisely. So I think there's an open question: does zero knowledge proving get better faster than the size of the training computation for an LLM also increase? And so maybe in 5 years it will be possible to prove things in ZK. But the other answer is that there are a lot of other approaches to coming up with verifiable computation, things like optimistic methods where you re-execute the computation, provide some game theoretic incentive for people to report when someone has not done the computation correctly. I think that part of this applicable to AI that's specifically an open question is if someone else who you don't trust is training your model, can they introduce some bias into the model, or can they introduce data into the model? And that I don't think there's any good solution to today. There have actually been some papers in the outside of crypto that has basically said, no, you can't. So I'm hopeful that there are new results there, but it's very bleeding edge.
And that's also, that holds true in a purely trustless environment. But if you're willing to introduce some trust to, as a more institutionalist, I think that you could have entities that can validate some of these things in an off-chain way and then post that validation on-chain. And then what you need are governance systems that make sure that these institutions represent the will of the people who care about whether or not this training was done well, was done in a less biased way. And they can incorporate all of the things that you might care about, like checking if it was the training data or whether it was the loss function. All these various things. That's way more flexible than doing this in a completely trustless, purely computational approach. But you can start to mix in trust to get these more hybrid solutions that can run way more efficiently and build off of a huge amount of legal, regulatory, and financial infrastructure we already have.
In the context of decentralized machine learning ops, in your opinion, what are the most technical challenges to solve in the context of privacy preserving? ZKP can solve some of the problem, but it cannot solve all the problem. And in your opinion, what's the most challenging?
The most challenging would be how do you run FHE for inference of models or for training of models, which would be fantastic, but seems if proving things in ZK is hard, running it in FHE is even harder. So if you're asking the hardest, most ambitious problem you could go out and tackle, I would say it's that. I don't know if that answers your question though. Fully homomorphic encryption, the idea that someone can compute over encrypted data. And so in that sense, with ZK, you're running some computation off-chain, then you're proving it on-chain, but theoretically, if you had FHE, then the entire blockchain could be encrypted, and you can compute over that encrypted data, and you would also have to prove that the computation was done correctly in ZK.
My take is going to be less controversial, or maybe more controversial. I think the hardest and most important thing in this space generally is
governance,
alignment, safety.
You need a governance alliance.
But the nice thing about a lot of these systems, you're talking about proving a system, you're probably not talking about proving something that is going to become an agentic superintelligence. So, well, maybe some people in this room are, and then we can talk more about that.
I mean, I'm really hopeful someone in this room is building an agentic superintelligence. That would be great.
Particularly a provable one, an on-chain provable one. That would be amazing.
Please.
So you guys talk a lot about theoretics and kind of infrastructure today, but also you guys see a lot of deal flow, a lot of deals. What are some the killer apps you guys are seeing? What are some the startups that are solving real problems at the intersection of crypto and AI?
I think sounds like a question for you. I have no deal flow.
There we go. Well, I mean, to answer your question directly, the one project we've invested in recently is Gentian, which I mentioned earlier. I do think generally there's a lot of focus on infrastructure, and that I focus mostly on infrastructure, so that's great and fun and interesting to talk about. I think one of the teams here that is probably better suited to answer this question for you are the Modulus guys, who I think are probably the most applied or sort of on the bleeding edge of what you can do with these new tools. And generally, I think in any system of adoption of new technology, you have infrastructure that enables new things, interesting engineers and developers come along and build new applications that are uncertain whether or not they'll work. A few of them really work and will push the infrastructure, which encourages new investment in infrastructure that enables future applications. So you have somewhat of a flywheel. And at least in my opinion, we're at the point in the flywheel where there's a lot of interesting new tools that you can use to build new applications, and people are trying to figure out precisely what they're good for.
All right, guys, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Evan and Guy.
Thank
for
you.
your time.
Thank you.